God has descended from the heavens, and it's not me, it's Matthew Matosis, to deliver scripture in the form of a new video titled Context Sensitivity, which doesn't tell you much just by the title. It's a basic, not clickbaity title as you would expect from Matthew. Matthew is my favorite YouTuber. I'm sure he's a lot of you guys' favorite YouTuber probably as well. For those who don't know, 2 years ago he announced that he would focus his efforts going forward on game development rather than videos about games. But he's always sort of hinted at the idea, yeah, he might come back for like the odd video. And, you know, watching his streams, I kind of had so he basically implied, yeah, if he's gonna come back, it's gonna be with a weird, really specific topic like that. Now that the video's out, I can definitely reverse engineer where the spark for it came from. He did mention that he had some hot takes on Shinobi, on the PS2, for example, in his recent streams, and just knowing he had to program the whole backbone for his game tells me, yeah, there's probably a lot of that in this video as well, with state machines and all that. I'm gonna dig into that as I explain what's going on. Basically, the topic of this video sort of takes a really interesting perspective on a topic that I've been thinking about a lot myself in the last couple of years. Because if you know me, you know that the systemic nature of games is really important to me and really crucial to the medium, in my opinion. And it's something that I actively look for in games, right? And it's interesting to me that me and Matthew in this case, we clearly care like about a similar thing, but he's found more concrete sort of anchor points for the thing I was thinking about, and then naturally reaches slightly different conclusions actually than what I did. So I guess I'll explain. You know, I think you should just watch the video, and that will help a lot. But I'll just frame the basics a little bit. Matthew is essentially making the observation that with most actions in games, there is a gradient between context insensitive and context sensitive, right? I guess the way I would define it, he doesn't do this in the video, but this is sort of how I was thinking about it. There's 3 elements in games that are interesting for this particular issue. There's the subject, which is, you know, the player character usually, not the player. I think those two should be looked at distinctly, right? I'm specifically thinking about the player character when I'm using the word subject. There's the action that the subject is performing, and the object. And usually the idea is that, yeah, you're performing an action upon an object, right? And Matthew's sort of posing this idea that, yeah, there's a spectrum for how these actions work, and specifically the spectrum revolves around how much does this action hinge on the object to be, or like how much does the nature of the action and how it's performed revolve around the object. So what the fuck does that mean, right? I'm gonna start with some of the examples that just appear in the video itself. Really basic. If you want to jump, you have to be on the ground. If you want to double jump, you have to be in the air. I really like the Space Invaders example where you can move left and right, but only up to the wall, right? Up to the edge of the screen. So once I'm at the edge of the screen, I can no longer move left. So in that sense, the action of moving left is actually somewhat context sensitive, right? There is a context where it's not possible, or where it is possible, right? So what Matthew concurs is that distinction on that end of the spectrum, right, on this milder end of the spectrum, is really pedantic, almost, right? Again, like the idea, oh, I can only jump when I'm on the ground, so the action is somewhat context sensitive. That seems really pedantic and like not that important, right? Because at the end of the day, I can jump very freely, right? I can jump whenever I want, right? The game is very transparent about when I can jump or not, right? So it doesn't, as Matthew puts it, it doesn't feel context sensitive. Now, I said earlier I can see why Matthew arrived at those kinds of ideas, or why this is something he cares about just from his current occupation. Because guess what? This kind of thing is really important with state machines in games. A state machine is a system of programming to basically structure and organize actions, right? You have the subject, right? And on a background level inside the game, you're constantly updating the subject state, right? You're informing the rest of the game about the character state. And then depending on what their state is, different actions are possible, right? So when I'm touching a wall, that's when the wall jump becomes successful. When I'm on the ground, that's when the regular jump becomes successful. And then naturally those actions, the game can very clearly say, okay, when you're in this state, these actions are available, whatever, right? So, because I know that this is something Matthew spent a lot of time on, just literally, physically implementing, I can see how that may change your perspective on games a little bit, right? And that's why he has such a keen eye on that thing right now. Now, what he seems to sort of get at and touch on is the idea that at a certain level of context sensitivity, there is a loss of control, right? Now, context sensitivity seems somewhat necessary in some games as games get more complex, right? Specifically, he makes the distinction between 2D and 3D. Having the extra dimension in 3D, yeah, I hate just like a verbatim copying all his examples from the video, but the Celeste versus Shinobi PS2 example puts it perfectly, right? In Celeste, I can dash in 8 directions. In Shinobi, I can dash 360 directions parallel to the ground, but I cannot dash up or down or any of the other fucking directions in between, right? I cannot dash spherically because that's fucking impossible to represent with the controller, right? And 3D games are naturally going to have those problems a lot. So the obvious solution for games was to just abstract and streamline and automate certain actions, right? And make them naturally more context sensitive. And then Matthew was arguing, yeah, like with that goes sort of a loss of control, right? Again, to take Shinobi as an example, you actually can dash upward, but to do so you have to lock onto an enemy that is above you, for example, and then the game will handle that, right? The game will snap you toward that target. And that naturally brings with it a lot of issues, right? What if the game doesn't target the right enemy in the first place? What if, like, it snaps to the enemy from an angle that you didn't quite anticipate, right? See, and I said earlier, this whole discussion is something that highly interests me, highly intrigues me. And you may have seen me talk about this before, but under very different terms. And actually, those terms have perpetuated themselves throughout the internet in general, particularly maybe in the fighting game sphere, as some of you may know. The terms that I have used in the past and sort of picked up from my environment are loose and rigid, or loose and tight, to describe a certain feeling that a game gives me, right? When I have the feeling that I can somehow act very freely and independent of, for example, the environment of the object, then a game feels loose, right? Whereas when a game gets sort of more dependent on objects, on the environment, and hinges its actions around that, or makes the actions revolve around that, then it gets more tight or more rigid. So kind of like I implied before, Matthew found a really concrete anchor point to describe something that I had as like a vague feeling that I couldn't quite pin down, right? It's funny, there's a whole video, tier list stream by Maximilian Dude, the fighting game fighting game legend, where he ranks games based on their looseness/tightness. And I think for a lot of people that just sounds like gibberish, right? It does not make sense at all. And I think the Matthew Matosis video actually helps us sort of find a specific criterion, or a set of criteria maybe, for this kind of thing. And the terminology I have arrived now for myself is like, yeah, does the action, again, I'm repeating myself, but does the action hinge on or revolve to a strong degree around its object, right? Now, one example that kind of was very, very interesting to me, that I sort of felt needed more nuance when Matthew talked about it, and I guess he did address it, but he didn't stress it as much as I personally would. Basically, he talks about Resident Evil 4, right? And in Resident Evil 4, you can aim freely in any direction, and then you just shoot in that direction, and then your shots can have certain outcomes, right? So, by that token, you would consider Resident Evil 4 relatively loose, right? Because your action doesn't hinge on the object at all. You can shoot whenever you want. You can shoot as freely as you want in any direction, right? Like, yes, it may not necessarily have an outcome or a meaningful outcome, but generally your action is completely independent of the object. And also generally, Matthew sort of makes the observation, yeah, that seems to be true for shooters in general. And maybe that's part of why shooters are like the dominant genre right now. I think that's a really interesting correlation. I do think there's merit to that, but that's not really what I want to talk about right now. Now, the part that I thought was interesting and where I think there needed to be more clarity in his video, or where I feel that his wording was not as precise as it needed to be, is the example that he gives where, yeah, you can shoot at an enemy's leg while they're running to make them trip over. And if you think about it, that is like a context-sensitive outcome, right? The context is, oh, the enemy is running and I'm shooting them at the leg, or in the leg, and then they have that specific reaction to it. And then Matthew makes the argument, yeah, but somehow it doesn't really feel context-sensitive because the outcome of the input doesn't revolve around the character, it revolves around the object, right? I think he has the right idea there, but I would word it very differently. I think the flaw is that it's not realizing that the action is the shot. The action is not tripping the enemy, right? Tripping the enemy is the outcome of your action. Generally, me shooting the enemy in the leg is not different from, like, functionally, the way I physically input it is not different from any other shot, right? It just so happens that because I did it at this specific time, at this specific location, to the object, that the object had a certain response to it, right? So, in that sense, I feel I watched the video and then I formed my own definition for that. I think my definition is maybe a little more mature. I don't know. But yeah, I think that is a really solid idea, right? To think about it this way, that it's desirable for your character's action to be as free and as loose as possible, but then the object can react in certain ways like that usually are going to be deterministic, right? Obviously in Resident Evil 4 it's deterministic that because the enemy is running, because I'm shooting in this specific region, that specific animation is going to play, right? It's not really RNG based or anything. Now, I just said a certain amount of looseness and context insensitivity, I guess, is desirable. Matthew makes the same argument. But I guess like one thing that I would have tried to bring a little more balance to the video. I guess one thing that I find interesting about the video under that light is the fact that it's easiest to explain with one of the specific examples later in the video, where basically Matthew sort of points out that, yeah, in the Mario games, the camera has gotten more and more passive, right? So you're expected to maneuver the camera at all times to get it into like a desirable position. Now, I and Matthew, we have made the argument in the past that that's really annoying, right? It's really annoying to have to play cameraman, and it's actually not fun at all, right? It kind of, it's incongruous with what you're looking for in the game, really, right? In a way that's not true for shooters, right? In shooters, moving the camera is the gameplay, right? So, again, as Matthew puts it, shooters just have a huge advantage from that angle. Yeah, but now, in this context, Matthew is electing to say, okay, you know what, I can see the argument for having the player maneuver the camera at all times, because it just means more control, right? So obviously, that raises the complexity of the controls. It may be more prone to failure from the player side, but they had full control at all times, right? There was no ambiguity over how certain things work. The player didn't have to trust like some kind of context-sensitive algorithm or whatever, or some layer of prediction or interpretation, right? The computer interpreting what the player wants to do. That never happens, and that in a way is more desirable than the opposite, right? Now, I guess I find it commendable that Matthew sort of, because I know that, actually, you see, I wonder how if I asked him about cameras now, how would he feel about that? Would he sort of elect to argue for the full degree of control and manual control, or would he stick more with his prior personal preference that was, more automated camera, whatever? I don't really know. I guess, like, for this, my assumption is now, for the sake of the video, he tried to highlight one over the other. Personally, so there's a really interesting example later, right, where he says, okay, let's say we have a prediction algorithm that never fails, right, that always moves the camera to the correct spot, right, that never produces an undesirable result. That's one option. Or you have some kind of eye tracking device in the TV or whatever that can follow your eye movement perfectly, and then the camera, he doesn't say camera. The example that he uses is a lock-on feature, but whatever, right? For the sake of simplicity, let's say, yeah, the eye tracker will move the camera where you're looking, right? And then you can actually reverse engineer where it's looking, right? There's visual feedback on the screen to tell you where your eyes are. So it's something you can manually control, that you have control over, right? Obviously, the latter system would fail in some instances, right? Because the player is too slow or whatever, blah, 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 blah. But he's making the argument, yeah, maybe, if you find more control more satisfying, then that may be the preferable solution, right? Personally, I see the argument, right? But I think I still disagree, right? I think I would actually opt to use a perfect algorithm for those kinds of situations, right? If I feel camera movement or lock-on or whatever is not fun and not part of the core conceit of the game, right? If it's something that just facilitates the game and that just, should get out of your way as much as possible, I would probably opt to select the algorithm, right, that acts perfectly. I wonder how Matthew feels about that particular conundrum, but yeah, that's where I'm at on that. And I guess again, that's for me something that was a little missing about the video, where the idea that some amount of tightness or rigidity or even context sensitivity can be desirable, right? And the example that I actually came up with, that's a little bit crazy, and I know in this Discord where I'm in with a lot of my friends, it's been kind of a meme. Rollback netcode. So to explain, it's a way to handle network interactions, most commonly known in fighting games. Obviously, the way online games work is that we just send each other our inputs, right? And then you have to assume at some point, internet is gonna have problems, right? We're gonna stop, like, let's say me and you are playing, and then at some point I stop receiving your inputs, right? You're not sending your inputs to me for like a couple seconds. So now from the developer side, the question is, okay, what do we do in that situation, right? The traditional answer had been for a long time, yeah, we'll just pause the game, right? We'll just stop the game for a little bit, and then when the connection comes back, then we'll receive inputs again, right? That is technically the system that adheres the most to like what the player is doing, right? Technically speaking, it's like the most similar to what Matthew is arguing for, right? But obviously, if you know anything about fighting games, everybody will tell you, yeah, delay-based netcode fucking sucks, right? We want rollback netcode. Rollback netcode, when the connection drops, when there's no inputs being sent or being received, there's an algorithm, a prediction algorithm, that will make assumptions about what the sender of the inputs that now isn't sending anymore, their internet connection dropped or whatever. They will make an assumption about what they're doing currently, right? And obviously, it will correct those assumptions on the fly if it sees that they were incorrect, right? But still, the argument is still there. Yeah, they're making assumptions, and it's not actually, clearly, I mean, if you've played rollback games, you'll know there are situations where you on your end will get a win, and the person on the other end, they'll get the win, right? Because at some point you desynced and something weird happened, right? And the game just didn't know what to do with it, right? It made too many inaccurate predictions. And you could make the argument, yeah, that even if you perfect it as much as possible, it's still ultimately a prediction. It's an assumption, right? It's not giving the players full control. But at the end of the day, also, we just have to be honest and say, yeah, it's still a way fucking better system than delay-based netcode, right? And we can improve it to the point where the amount of control that we're giving up is negligible, right? And at the end of the day, it does result in the better experience. Like, no one who has seriously sort of researched those topics and put time into it and actually played those games, right? No one will tell you that delay-based netcode, which technically gives you more control or is more accurate, is more true to what the players actually did. Nobody will fucking prefer that, right? So that, it's just funny because Matthew always uses these super hypothetical, far-fetched examples with like eye tracking and fucking machine learning algorithms or whatever, when we actually have a practical example in the real world, right? Where we've already opted to select the easy option that, yes, gives up a little bit of control, but in the practical experience of things, smooths out and streamlines things in a way that is very desirable and is arguably the right choice for pretty much everybody involved, right? So I think that's what the video needed, right? It needed to more strongly suggest, yeah, this is still a case-by-case thing, right? I think there's certain aspects of games where it's okay to give up a little bit of control. And obviously, I think Matthew knows this, right? Like, a lot of his favorite games, I mean, he mentions Bayonetta, right? And Bayonetta has a soft lock, right? And the soft lock is really good, and the game I just don't see how else it would work, right? Again, I'm not saying that Matthew doesn't know this. I think he's perfectly aware of it. He just chose not to highlight this sort of case-by-case dichotomy. And I think that's okay. It's just the thing that sprung to mind for me and the 2 cents that I wanted to add. I guess, like, the crucial thing, the best takeaway from the video is that you can just look at it as a design philosophy, right? And then decide case by case how you want to implement certain features, right? So obviously the title of the video, right? I had to inevitably think, okay, if you actually wanted to do fishing in Breath of the Wild though, how would you do it, right? How would you do something that still agrees with the game's mechanics, right? That doesn't take you into a separate mode of play. Well, what you would have to do probably is the fishing rod is a weapon, and you pick it up like a weapon, you put it in your hand like any other weapon. And then maybe if you hold the button, you throw it out, and then you move Link to move the rod, right? The rod itself can move, you just move. You don't move Link's hands, you still move Link, right? And then that will in turn pull the rod in a certain direction. And then if you let go of the button, you pull, right? Or maybe you can mash the button to pull harder. That would also still kind of agree with the controls, right? Because, yeah, the way I'm picturing it with every weapon in the game, if you mash the button, Link is stationary. So mashing the rod to pull on it, I think would make a lot of sense, right? Maybe the best way to do it is like hold to prepare the rod, and then release to throw it, and then mash to reel it in. I think that's probably the best implementation, yeah. And then obviously the fish will follow the lure or whatever, and you could give the fish AI to sort of work around that, and then the fish will actually physically move, right? It will not, obviously in Ocarina of Time, for example, right? Once the fish is out of the water, it turns like, it's not the same object anymore, you know, it's not the same fish. It's like, programmatically, it's a totally different thing. Whereas in Breath of the Wild, you could actually do it like, okay, the fish actually physically is magnetically attached to the rod, and then it moves, and then you press A to pick it up, and then it just beams into your inventory. Like, once you think about design principles in this way, it's actually not impossible to come up with solutions for those kinds of problems, right? I guess, like, yeah, to tie it back to the loose versus rigid versus tight, whatever dichotomy, you know, I always had the idea that Resident Evil 4 is actually a more rigid game than a loose game. Because, yes, my actions are completely independent of the objects, but they're also useless without the objects, right? Like, if I shoot at stuff, shooting only makes sense if I have something to shoot at, right? Whereas, like, in a platformer, you really only need the floor, right? And then you can already have some fun. So those were the categories that I always thought about it. I guess those kinds of ideas and those kinds of that terminology, even maybe, I don't have to abandon that entirely just because of this video. even though I agree with, I think the definition that this video finds for these terms or these situations is very interesting and very, very on point, right? It makes sense in a lot of cases. I guess there's still somewhat of a difference in feeling as well, right? I guess like one criterion that, or one set of terms that I like to use is analog versus digital. I feel like something that is more analog also happens to be looser and maybe even less context sensitive. To kind of explain what I mean, the example that I came up with is movement in Sonic versus Mega Man. Obviously both games are played with a D-pad, which is a digital input, but then Sonic has gradual acceleration and deceleration. So if I stop inputting anything, Sonic will still move, he will still take time to stop moving. Whereas in Mega Man, I get exactly what I put in at all times, right? If I tap the button for a split second, that's how far Mega Man will move, and he will instantly decelerate as well. So that kind of example fits my definition of loose versus rigid, right? Mega Man is more rigid, Sonic is more loose. Does that tie into context sensitive versus insensitive? I don't exactly know, right? In a way, like Sonic, for example, he has more ways that he responds to the environments. Does that make him more context sensitive? I don't know, dude. I guess, again, kind of like implied at the beginning, you know, it's clearly Matthew cares about a similar issue that I did, but then he finds a different angle on it, and then that angle gives you very different conclusions at certain points. And that's what I found super fascinating about this video. Yeah, I raised points against the video in a way a little bit, but that's not really meant as critique. Obviously I know where he was coming from, right? I just wanted to add my own 2 cents because as I said, like, this is something that very directly interests me, right? This is like extremely my niche, my interest field as far as game design goes. I think I said it before, like one of the most life-changing quotes in my game design class, my media studies class, was when my lecturer said, yeah, games are, they represent systems dynamically, right? That's the defining feature of games. And that really snowballed into a whole ideology almost for me, like, okay, this is the stuff that I look for in games, and this is why JRPGs are bad. Yeah. Great video. Really interesting to think about. Really fun to talk about. Let me know where you're at on this subject. Is this something you care about? I feel like it's something that most people don't really care about, right? I feel like it's just a really subtle, below the surface thing that is not a super active consideration, right? It's just a thing that determines how games work, right? And we don't really question it. But yeah, like I said, personally, it's something that makes me feel like an insane person sometimes, where I think about it so much. Yeah, I'm still working on the Sifu tutorial. That's coming soon. Probably gonna stream again soon, but I'm gonna upload this first because it's very topical. Yeah, bye bye.